For a long time, I believed retirement would finally bring peace. I thought it would mean freedom from deadlines, pressure, and the constant feeling of having to be somewhere or prove something. I imagined quieter mornings would feel lighter, that slower days would naturally bring relief, and that once the work was done, the weight I had carried for years would simply lift on its own. People around me said the same thing. They told me I would finally relax, that I had earned this stage of life, that it was my time now. And I believed them, because it made sense. After decades of responsibility, peace felt like the logical reward. But it didn't arrive the way I expected. It didn't come with a sense of relief or calm. Instead, it arrived quietly, almost unnoticed at first. At the beginning, the silence felt welcome. It felt like rest, like space, like permission to stop. But as days passed, that silence changed. It became heavier, more present, and less comforting. I began to realize that peace isn't simply the absence of work, and rest isn't the same as stillness. I wasn't stressed anymore, but I wasn't calm either. I wasn't exhausted, but I wasn't fulfilled. Retirement removed the noise, but it also removed the structure I didn't know I depended on. And in that quiet space, something unexpected surfaced. I started to understand that peace doesn't automatically follow when a lifetime of responsibility ends. Sometimes, it simply reveals what was never addressed beneath the busyness of work. When I was still working, I used to imagine retirement as a kind of emotional destination. Not a dramatic one, but a calm place where things would finally settle. I believed that once the responsibilities ended, my mind would naturally slow down, my thoughts would become quieter, and a sense of peace would fill the space that work had occupied for so many years. It seemed logical. After all, work had been the source of most pressure, stress, and urgency in my life. Removing it should have brought relief. But what I didn't understand back then was how deeply work had shaped not just my schedule, but my inner world. My days had rhythm because of it. My sense of purpose was tied to it. Even my worries had direction. When something bothered me, it usually had a reason connected to work, and that reason gave the discomfort a shape I could recognize. Without realizing it, I had grown used to that structure, even when it was exhausting. When retirement finally arrived, the change was immediate on the surface. My alarm clock no longer mattered. There were no meetings to prepare for, no deadlines waiting, no messages demanding quick responses. At first, this felt like freedom. I told myself this was exactly what I had been waiting for. I enjoyed the slower mornings and the absence of urgency. For a while, it felt like a long-awaited pause. But as the weeks passed, I noticed that something felt off. The calm I expected didn't deepen. Instead, it stayed shallow, like a surface stillness that never quite reached inside. I wasn't anxious, but I wasn't relaxed either. I wasn't unhappy, but I wasn't content. It was confusing, because on paper, everything seemed right. I had time, I had fewer responsibilities, I had no immediate pressures, and yet, peace remained out of reach. I began to realize that peace isn't something that automatically appears when stress disappears. Stress had been loud and obvious, but its absence revealed something quieter and more complicated. Without the constant demands of work, my thoughts had more space to move, and they didn't always move in comforting directions. Questions I had postponed for years began to surface, not aggressively, but persistently. I found myself wondering who I was without my role. For decades, my identity had been reinforced by what I did. My job gave me a clear answer when someone asked who I was or what I contributed. Without it, those answers felt less certain. I didn't feel lost exactly, but I felt undefined, as if the outline of my life had softened without the structure that once held it in place. Another thing I hadn't anticipated was how silence would affect me. I had always associated silence with rest, but this kind of silence was different. It wasn't just quiet, it was open-ended. There was no clear purpose attached to it. At times, it felt peaceful, but at other times, it felt heavy, as if it were waiting for something that never arrived. I began to understand that silence, when it lasts too long, can make you confront parts of yourself you didn't have time to face before. I also noticed how often I checked the time out of habit, even though there was nowhere I needed to be. My body remembered routines that no longer existed. This created a subtle tension, a feeling of being prepared for something that never came. It wasn't stressful, but it was unsettling. It made me realize how deeply my sense of readiness had been tied to external expectations. People around me assumed I was enjoying this stage of life. They spoke about retirement as if it were a universal reward, a long vacation that never ended. I didn't correct them, because there was nothing to correct on the surface. I wasn't suffering, but I also wasn't experiencing the peace everyone seemed to expect. Explaining that felt unnecessary, and maybe even ungrateful, so I kept it to myself. As time passed, I started to understand that peace requires more than the absence of responsibility. It requires a sense of alignment, a feeling that your inner life matches the way you spend your days. Work had once provided that alignment, even when it was demanding. Without it, I had to figure out what would replace it, and that wasn't something I could rush or force. I realized that retirement had removed the noise, but it hadn't addressed what lay underneath. During my working years, I had been too busy to ask certain questions. What actually fulfills me? What gives my days meaning beyond obligation? What parts of myself had been quiet for years, waiting for attention? Retirement didn't answer these questions. It simply made them unavoidable. There were moments when I missed the pressure of work, not because I wanted the stress back, but because it gave my days direction. Pressure, I learned, can sometimes disguise purpose. Without it, purpose doesn't disappear, but it becomes harder to define. I had to accept that this stage of life required a different kind of effort, one that wasn't visible or measurable. This realization was uncomfortable, but it was also honest. Peace, I began to understand, is not something that arrives automatically at the end of a long career. It's something that has to be built, slowly and deliberately, on a foundation that goes deeper than routine. Retirement wasn't the end of my inner work. In many ways, it was the beginning. And as unsettling as that felt, it also meant that this stage of life wasn't empty. It was simply asking different questions, quieter ones, that I was only now ready to hear. As retirement settled into my daily life, I began to notice how much of my energy had once been directed outward. When I was working, even difficult days had a clear destination. There was always something that needed attention, something that demanded focus. Now, with that external pull gone, my attention slowly turned inward, and that shift was more challenging than I expected. I wasn't used to spending this much time with my own thoughts, without distraction or interruption. During my working years, I rarely questioned whether my days had meaning. Meaning was built into the routine. You show up, you contribute, you solve problems, and at the end of the day, there is a quiet sense that something was accomplished. Retirement removed that automatic reassurance. Days still passed, but they didn't leave the same imprint behind. At times, this made the hours feel lighter, but at other times, it made them feel strangely empty. I started to notice small habits that no longer made sense. I would plan my mornings carefully, only to realize there was nothing urgent waiting. I would finish tasks quickly and then feel unsure about what came next. This wasn't boredom in the usual sense. It was a lack of direction. a sense that time had opened up without providing guidance on how to fill it meaningfully. The idea that peace would naturally follow retirement began to feel naive. Peace, I realized, isn't just about slowing down, it's about feeling grounded in your life, knowing why your days matter. Without work to provide that structure, I had to confront the question of meaning directly. And that question didn't come with easy answers. I also became more aware of how much my self-worth had been quietly tied to productivity. Even when I didn't think of myself as defined by my job, the rhythm of work had shaped how I measured my value. Being busy felt like being useful. Being needed felt like being relevant. Retirement disrupted that equation. Suddenly, usefulness was no longer obvious, and relevance felt less certain. There were moments when this realization made me uncomfortable. I didn't want to admit that I missed being needed. I had spent years looking forward to a slower pace, to freedom from obligation. Yet here I was, unsettled by the very freedom I had long anticipated. This contradiction was difficult to accept, because it challenged the story I had told myself about what a good life should look like after work. I began to notice how society talks about retirement in simplified terms. It's often described as a reward, a time to finally enjoy life. While there is truth in that, it overlooks the inner adjustment required when a major source of identity disappears. Enjoyment doesn't automatically replace purpose. Leisure doesn't automatically replace meaning. These things have to be cultivated, and that process takes time. As the days continued, I found myself reflecting more deeply on what peace actually means. I realized that I had been imagining peace as a permanent emotional state, something that would arrive and stay once the pressures of work were gone. But peace, like most meaningful experiences, is dynamic. It comes and goes. It's influenced by how aligned we feel with our lives, not just by how busy or relaxed we are. I also noticed that without the structure of work, unresolved thoughts had more room to surface. During my working years, I had pushed certain questions aside, telling myself there would be time for them later. Now that later had arrived, and those questions were no longer willing to wait, they asked about choices I had made, paths I hadn't taken, parts of myself I had neglected. This wasn't regret exactly, but it was reflection. And reflection can be unsettling when it arrives all at once. There were days when I felt restless without knowing why. I wasn't unhappy, but I felt slightly out of sync with my own life. This restlessness wasn't dramatic. It didn't demand immediate action. It lingered quietly, reminding me that something needed attention, even if I couldn't yet name what it was. I tried filling my time with activities, thinking that staying busy might recreate the sense of satisfaction I once found in work. Some of these activities were enjoyable, but they didn't address the deeper issue. Activity alone wasn't enough. I realized that peace isn't built by simply replacing one routine with another. It requires a deeper understanding of what truly matters to you when external expectations fade. This realization led me to a difficult but important understanding. Retirement doesn't solve inner questions, it amplifies them. Without the distractions of work, you're left with a clearer view of your inner landscape. That clarity can be uncomfortable, but it's also honest. It forces you to see yourself as you are, rather than as you functioned in a role. I also became more patient with myself during this time. I stopped expecting immediate answers or sudden contentment. I began to accept that this stage of life was a transition, not a destination. Transitions are rarely smooth, especially when they involve redefining long-held identities. Allowing myself to move through this period without judgment became an important part of the process. Gradually, I started to see that the absence of peace wasn't a failure. It was information. It showed me that peace had never been something I could simply arrive at. It was something I needed to actively build, based on self-awareness rather than routine. Retirement didn't remove my need for meaning. It simply removed the framework that had once provided it automatically. This understanding didn't bring immediate calm, but it brought clarity. And clarity, I learned, is often the first step toward peace. By recognizing that my expectations had been unrealistic, I could begin to adjust them. I could stop waiting for peace to appear on its own and start exploring what peace might actually look like for me. Now, in this quieter stage of life, I began to accept that peace might be less about comfort and more about honesty, less about relaxation and more about alignment. Retirement wasn't meant to be a reward that erased all discomfort. It was an opportunity to engage with life differently, to ask questions that had been postponed, and to shape a sense of purpose that wasn't dependent on obligation. As this realization settled in, I felt a subtle shift. The restlessness didn't disappear, but it softened. I stopped resisting it and started listening to it. In doing so, I began to understand that peace, when it comes, is quieter and more fragile than I had imagined. It doesn't arrive fully formed. It grows slowly, through awareness, patience, and a willingness to redefine what fulfillment means. As the months went by, I began to understand that what I was feeling wasn't simple dissatisfaction. It was something more subtle, harder to define. It wasn't sadness, and it wasn't anxiety in the way I had known it before. It was a quiet sense of disconnection, a feeling that my days were no longer anchored to anything specific. Without realizing it, I had lost my sense of direction, even though nothing around me seemed wrong. During my working years, direction had always been clear. Even when I felt overwhelmed, I knew what was expected of me. There were goals to reach, problems to solve, responsibilities to carry. That clarity created a kind of inner stability. Now, with that framework gone, my days felt open in a way that was both freeing and unsettling. Freedom without direction can feel surprisingly heavy. I noticed this most in the middle of the day. Mornings still had some structure, and evenings brought natural closure. But the long stretch in between often felt undefined. I would sit down, stand up, move from one room to another, not because I had something to do, but because I was trying to feel settled. This restlessness wasn't dramatic. It was quiet, persistent, and difficult to explain. I began to realize how much I had relied on external structure to regulate my inner state. Work didn't just organize my time, it organized my emotions. It gave me a reason to push through discomfort, to postpone certain feelings, to focus on tasks instead of questions. Without it, there was nothing to distract me from the parts of myself that had been waiting patiently for attention. These parts didn't arrive with urgency. They surfaced slowly, in moments of stillness. I would find myself thinking about past choices, not with regret, but with curiosity. I wondered whether I had known myself as well as I thought I did, whether I had truly listened to what mattered to me, or whether I had simply followed the path that made the most sense at the time. Retirement created space for these reflections, and space can be uncomfortable when you're not used to it. I wasn't accustomed to examining my inner life without a clear purpose. In the past, reflection had always been tied to action. Think, decide, move forward. Now, reflection seemed to exist for its own sake, without an obvious outcome. This felt unfamiliar and, at times, frustrating. I also became aware of a subtle fear beneath the restlessness. A fear that if I stopped moving altogether, I might feel empty. That without goals or deadlines, my days would lose their meaning. This fear wasn't something I talked about. It stayed internal, shaping my behavior quietly. I filled my time with small tasks, not because they were necessary, but because they gave me something to complete. Over time, I began to question whether this constant need to fill space was actually preventing peace, rather than creating it. I had imagined peace as a state of rest, but perhaps I hadn't learned how to rest internally. Slowing down externally didn't automatically slow my mind. Without practice, stillness can feel like exposure rather than comfort. I started to observe my thoughts more closely. I noticed how often I judged my own days, whether they were productive enough, useful enough, worthwhile enough. These judgments didn't disappear just because I had retired. They had followed me into this new stage of life, even though the context had changed. Recognizing this was important. It showed me that peace wasn't being blocked by circumstances, but by habits of thinking I had carried for years. I also reflected on how rarely we're taught to live without striving. Most of our lives are built around progress, achievement, and improvement. We're encouraged to move forward, to grow, to build. Retirement disrupts that narrative. Suddenly, there is no obvious next step, no ladder to climb, no clear measure of success. Learning how to live without striving requires unlearning patterns that have been reinforced for decades. This unlearning didn't happen quickly. There were days when I felt impatient with myself, wondering why I couldn't simply enjoy the freedom I had been given. But impatience only added another layer of tension. Slowly, I realized that this stage of life wasn't asking me to perform better at rest. It was asking me to develop a different relationship with time altogether. I began experimenting with allowing my days to unfold without forcing structure onto them. This didn't mean doing nothing. It meant doing things without expecting them to define me. A walk wasn't a task to complete. Reading wasn't a way to improve myself. Sitting quietly wasn't wasted time. These small shifts were difficult at first, because they challenged my sense of control. But over time, they began to soften the restlessness I had been carrying. I also started to notice moments of quiet satisfaction that didn't come from accomplishment. Simple moments, like noticing the light change in a room, or finishing a conversation without feeling rushed. These moments were subtle, but they felt genuine. They suggested that peace might exist in smaller forms than I had imagined, forms that didn't announce themselves or last forever. This realization didn't eliminate the sense of emptiness entirely. There were still days when the lack of direction felt heavy. But I began to understand that emptiness isn't always something to be filled. Sometimes, it's something to be understood. It can be a signal that old frameworks no longer apply, and that new ones haven't fully formed yet. I also recognized that this process required patience I wasn't used to practicing. During my working years, effort usually led to results. You work harder, you solve the problem, you move forward. Inner transitions don't follow the same rules. You can't force clarity or peace through effort alone. They develop slowly, often when you stop trying to control them. As this understanding settled in, I became more gentle with myself. I stopped treating my restlessness as a flaw, and started seeing it as part of the adjustment. Retirement wasn't meant to deliver peace instantly. It was meant to create the conditions where peace could eventually grow, if I allowed it the time it needed. I realized that this stage of life wasn't about finding a perfect sense of calm. It was about learning how to live with uncertainty, without fighting it. About accepting that not every day needs to feel meaningful in a dramatic way. Sometimes, meaning is quiet, almost invisible, and only becomes clear in hindsight. This perspective didn't solve everything, but it shifted how I related to my experience. I stopped waiting for peace to arrive, and started paying attention to how I responded to the absence of it. In doing so, I began to see that peace isn't something that replaces restlessness entirely. It exists alongside it, in moments of acceptance and awareness. Retirement hadn't brought the peace I expected, but it had offered something else, the chance to understand myself beyond structure and achievement. That understanding was uncomfortable at times, but it was honest. And honesty, I was learning, is often the doorway through which peace eventually enters. As I moved deeper into this stage of life, I began to accept that peace was never meant to arrive all at once. It wasn't waiting for me at the end of my career, ready to replace effort with comfort. Peace, I realized, is not a reward for endurance. It's something that slowly develops through how you relate to yourself when the noise finally fades. When work ended, I expected my inner world to become quieter. Instead, my thoughts became clearer and more present. Without deadlines and routines, there was nothing left to distract me from myself. At first, this felt uncomfortable. I had spent years moving forward without stopping to examine what I was carrying. Retirement didn't create that discomfort, but it gave it space to surface. I slowly understood that much of my restlessness came from resisting this honesty. I wanted peace to feel easy and comforting. Instead, it asked me to slow down enough to notice old habits of thinking and expectations I had never questioned before. Without work to define my days, I had to face who I was, without performance or productivity. Over time, I stopped asking why peace hadn't arrived and began asking a different question. What if peace isn't the absence of unease, but the ability to sit with it without panic? This shift changed how I experienced my days. I no longer expected every moment to feel calm. I allowed moments of discomfort to exist without judging them as failure. I also realized how much pressure I had placed on myself to do retirement right, to enjoy it constantly, to feel grateful all the time. That pressure made me judge my own experience instead of living it. Letting go of that judgment was important. I reminded myself that there is no correct emotional response to this stage of life. Adjustment takes time, and it looks different for everyone. There were still quiet days that felt long, and moments when I missed the clarity that work once provided. But instead of trying to fix those feelings, I allowed them to pass. I learned that not every emotion needs a solution. Some simply need space. Giving myself that space felt unfamiliar, but it also felt honest. Gradually, a different kind of calm began to appear. Not the calm I had imagined, but something subtler. I felt less rushed internally and less driven by expectations that no longer applied. I stopped searching for something to replace work and began trusting that my days didn't need to justify themselves. I came to understand that peace is rarely loud or dramatic. It doesn't announce its arrival. It shows up quietly, in small moments, sitting without needing to move, ending a day without evaluating whether it was productive, allowing time to pass without trying to control it. These moments didn't feel extraordinary, but they felt real. Retirement didn't remove complexity from life. It simply moved it inward. The challenges became less visible and more internal, centered on identity, meaning, and self-acceptance. Facing these challenges required a different kind of strength, one not measured by achievement or usefulness. I stopped waiting for peace to replace everything else. I accepted that it could exist alongside uncertainty and restlessness. This acceptance didn't erase discomfort, but it made it easier to carry. I no longer expected retirement to deliver a final emotional state. Instead, I saw it as an ongoing process of learning how to live with more awareness and less distraction. Retirement may not have brought the peace I expected, but it brought something just as valuable. It brought clarity. It brought honesty. It brought the opportunity to understand myself without the constant pressure of obligation. That opportunity didn't feel peaceful at first, but it was meaningful. Peace, I learned, doesn't come from the end of work. It comes from learning how to live truthfully when the noise fades. And that lesson, even when uncomfortable, has been worth learning.